Late at night, standing under the light of an old lantern, a man desperately asked a girl to confess just one thing to him. He begged her to tell him that her daughter was his child. Jango raised a confused look at him. Ji-hyun put his hand to his chest and again asked the girl to confess that Yena was their common daughter. The girl trembled. She had lived with this pain for so long, but now she looked at the man who looked like he was the only one in pain. She gently ran her hand over his cheek, thinking about what had made him come to such despair. Ji-hyun wrapped his hand around her palm, pressed it against her cheek, and quietly repeated for her to tell him it was true. The girl looked at his pleading eyes and thought she had to tell him the truth. Then suddenly she withdrew her hand, deciding she had no regrets. The girl looked him boldly in the eye and told him he was right, and that Yena was really his child. The man's heart seemed to skip a beat. Jango continued to stand and stare at the dumbfounded man, and quietly added that she wanted to say that it was their shared daughter. 7 years ago, a girl held a positive pregnancy test with trembling hands. 22-year-old college student Jung-oh couldn't believe what she saw. She put her head down on the table in despair. Several tests confirmed that she was pregnant. The girl tried to calm down, repeating to herself mentally that now it was necessary to soberly assess the situation. She tried to remember when things had gone wrong, and the night she and Ji-hyun had spent together came back to her mind. Jango remembered his beautiful eyes and athletic body, the way he looked at her in love. She was sure he couldn't have done it on purpose. All these thoughts made the girl blush and become embarrassed. But the question remained, when had it happened that they had let their guard down? The girl then began to think feverishly about how to tell her boyfriend about it and whether he would go to the hospital with her. Most of all, she was worried that he would be angry with her. And then suddenly she began to berate herself for such thoughts. If anyone was to blame, it was him, because he was the reason she was pregnant. In despair and not knowing what to do, the girl tiredly reclined her head when suddenly on her phone came a text from a boyfriend. He said he would be at their meeting place soon. The girl quickly put all the tests in her dresser and hurried off to her date. Jung-oh stood in the street and looked around. Her boyfriend should have been there by now, but she couldn't see him anywhere. And then suddenly there was a light breeze and her gaze caught on a tall, handsome male figure. Ji-hyun stood against the wall and looked at his phone. The girl called his name. Ji-hyun Jong was 26 years old and in his senior year of university. When he heard his girlfriend's voice, he immediately turned in her direction. When the girl approached him, he immediately scolded her for dressing so lightly because it was cold outside. Immediately, he dropped his coat on her shoulders. Jango had been receiving warmth and care from him all the time during their 6 months of relationship. The man looked at her and said it was for the best. They first met 8 months ago when the girl was on a working holiday in Australia. She stood outside the Korean shop crying because she hadn't eaten anything in 2 days. Hearing of her distress, he easily lent her money. He was a very nice guy from the start. Ji-hyun has always been gentle and reliable and has always protected the girl. And even now that they've been in a relationship for a while, he's still behaving perfectly. Jung-oh was worried that he might get cold because he gave her his coat. She tried to convince him that she wasn't cold at all, but the man just smiled and softly said it suited her even better. The young men held hands and chatted merrily as they decided where they would go. Ji-hyun offered to come in for a snack, but the girl said she wasn't hungry. In fact, she wasn't feeling well. That answer surprised him. He looked at the girl carefully. The man knew she liked to eat, so he thought it was strange that she refused now. He reached out and put his hand to her forehead, checking her temperature. Jung-oh instantly blushed and was embarrassed. Then he took her face in his hands and saw that her cheeks were flushed and she was breathing frequently. The girl was actually very worried, and his concern made her panic even more. Ji-hyun put his arm round her and said he'd take her home because she seemed ill. As he approached the girl's house, he said she needed to get up and rest. Jung-oh invited him to visit. She really wanted him to go with her, 'cause she wanted to tell him about the pregnancy, so the man tried to object, saying that the girl needed a rest and he had some business to attend to at home. But suddenly he heard his girlfriend being called by her name by some strange bloke. He turned round and saw a young man smiling affably at the girl. Jung-oh smiled at him too and said hello. The guy came over and stroked the girl's head and asked why he hadn't seen her in a month. The girl smiled wryly and said she was busy. The guy jokingly asked if she was so busy dating, and they both laughed. Ji-hyun watched with his arms crossed and a disgruntled look on his face. Ji-hyun noticed Ji-hyun's fiery gaze and smiled awkwardly. He hurriedly left and wished them a goodbye, saying they would chat later on. Jung-oh waved goodbye to him. She sensed a change in her boyfriend's mood. She said that this sunbai is a senior student from her department and that he lives nearby. Suddenly, Ji-hyun said he'd come over to visit her. When the girl was surprised and said he had business to attend to, the man just gritted his teeth and said it was okay. Jango wasn't sure why he'd suddenly agreed to visit her, but she was glad in the end. She tried to gather her thoughts to start an important conversation with him. Opening the door, the girl tried to decide how to break the news to him. She didn't know where to start and was afraid that he would understand her correctly. As soon as they entered the flat, Ji-hyun hugged her from behind and nuzzled into her neck, inhaling her scent. The girl dropped her bag and froze in surprise. The man gently whispered in her ear that she was very beautiful and sweet. Her cheeks flushed again, and then he said in a hurt tone of voice that he was worried about it because there were so many guys around. The girl replied that he shouldn't worry too much because he's prettier. Ji-hyun turned her around to face him and hugged her tightly, telling her not to say that, because she was the most beautiful one. Jango laid her head on his chest, her heart full of tenderness and love. The man bent his head to her face and said that she seemed to be cold. And then he looked her in the eye and said she needed to be warmed up right away. Before she knew it, he kissed her gently but insistently. His hands drew the girl to him. Breathing heavily, the girl pulled away and decided that this was the perfect moment to confess to him. His eyes were misty and their fingers were intertwined. She looked him in the eye and plucked up the courage to say she had something to tell him. Ji-hyun noticed her worried look and said he was ready to listen to her, whatever she was going to tell him. The girl was worried. Her heart was beating fast, and she pressed her hand to her stomach, not knowing where to start. The man stared at her probingly, and all her resolve evaporated. Instead of what she had originally wanted, she said she was hungry. He folded his arms across his chest and exhaled and replied that he knew it was weird when she said she wasn't hungry. The girl sighed in relief, and Ji-hyun offered to cook dinner for her. Jango looked at him and couldn't believe she had such a caring boyfriend. She didn't want to deceive him, but she wasn't ready to tell him yet. She decided to be brave enough to tell him later. The man went to the kitchen and started cooking the girl's favorite dish. He felt confident as he was a very good cook. He liked cooking for Jango. The girl sat mesmerized watching him. She said she'd never tire of watching him cook. The man smiled gently at her without answering anything. There was harmony and love between them. Soon he placed a plate in front of the girl and told her to eat. After a few minutes, a completely satisfied Jango emptied her plate, smiling contentedly. Ji-hyun touched her forehead and asked how she felt now. The girl said she was fine. She decided that she would tell her boyfriend about her pregnancy, but first she would make sure. She was sure that he would understand her. The man started clearing the table and said he'd leave early so she could get some proper rest. He washed the dishes and put the leftovers food in the fridge. Suddenly, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed something lying on the table and turned round to look at it. He knew what it was and what it was for. Thoughts swirled in his head and he moved towards the table. He had to find out the result. The unsuspecting Jung-oh happily thanked the guy for lending her his coat and for dinner. But he interrupted her, sternly asking what it was and pointing to the test that was on the table. He took the plastic, which clearly showed 2 stripes. The girl looked at the guy in horror and threw herself to him. She couldn't believe that she had so recklessly left the pregnancy test on the table. She quickly snatched it from him. This was not at all how she had planned to break the news to him. Jango opened a drawer in the desk to hide the test. Ji-hyun stood behind her with his head down. He froze. He reached over and pulled back the drawer, seeing a few tests. He scrutinized them. They were all positive. The man asked her, "What is all this?" The girl gritted her teeth and trembled with excitement. She was very worried about his reaction. Ji-hyun finally understood why the girl was so anxious. He started to come to his senses. He put his arm around her lightly and the girl flinched. He said it was all right. The man turned the girl round to face him and hugged her, telling her not to worry and that she needed to rest. He assured her that they would be fine and that they would be sure to discuss everything later on. Ji-hyun threw on his coat and told her not to see him off, but to go straight to bed and that he would call her later. Jango stood like that without uttering a word. She was confused. The door behind the man slammed shut and the girl was left standing there, unable to move. She didn't know how this evening was going to turn out. Later, as she lay in her bed, her phone rang. It was Ji-hyun. She breathed a sigh of relief because she really didn't think she'd ever hear him again. She answered the phone and a caring voice on the other end of the phone inquired if it had woken her up. The girl replied that she hadn't. In fact, she was so tense that she didn't think she could sleep. Ji-hyun suddenly said that she forgot the tangerine in his coat pocket. The girl sat up in bed excitedly, wondering if it was the first thing he wanted to talk about. She said it was okay, and he could eat it. Then the man suddenly said he wanted to go to the hospital with her. Jung-oh hummed questioningly. The man's voice trembled, but he asked, "Don't they have to get the maternity notebook and checkups done in general?" While the girl froze with surprise, the man clutched the red velvet box tightly in his hand and said that he had looked up the info. And so far, it was the only thing he realized they had to do. Tears came to the girl's eyes and her nose pinched. She mentally berated herself for thinking badly of her wonderful boyfriend. Then she burst into tears and confessed that she was afraid he wasn't happy that she was expecting a baby with him. Ji-hyun was surprised and asked why she thought he would be upset. He felt sorry that she felt that way and suggested they meet tomorrow to talk everything over in person and also go to the hospital together. Jango felt joy overwhelming her. She happily replied that of course she would meet him tomorrow. The man wanted to say something else, but then he suddenly stopped talking. He smiled, thinking he'd like to tell her he loved her, but he'd rather leave that for tomorrow. So he just wished her a good night's sleep and told her he looked forward to seeing her again. Putting the phone away, he smiled as joy and warmth filled his body. He wished tomorrow would come sooner. He realized that a marriage proposal might be unexpected for a girl, but he wanted to marry her and hoped that she would say yes. The man always used protection, though he remembered one time when it might have happened. Maybe it might have been a mistake, but now that things had turned out this way, he wanted to marry her as soon as possible. He was thinking that he didn't want to ruin her dreams and that he would definitely become the man of her dreams, the best man. He loves her very much. Ji-hyun sat and held a box in which the engagement ring lay. He imagined putting it on his girlfriend's finger tomorrow. The next day, a man stepped out of the shower, getting ready for a meeting when suddenly his phone rang. Jango texted him to say she was looking forward to seeing him. The man smiled, thinking how nice she was that she was probably in a hurry to get to him. He had carefully chosen his suit to look nice for the big day. As he buttoned his shirt, he thought about the fact that he had to leave early so he could stop at the flower shop. He was already picking out a tie when he got a call from his mother. The woman was upset that her son came home last night and left so quickly. They didn't even have time to talk. The man apologized and said he was very busy. The mother replied that he was always too busy and had little time for his family. She asked him to come home and play Go with his dad and stay for dinner. Ji-hyun asked if they were okay, and the woman said yes. But she was worried about his brother, as someone had egged his car the other day. The man told her not to worry and that he would sort it out later. Then he said he was coming home soon because he wanted to introduce his parents to someone. The woman was surprised and asked who he was talking about, but her son said he would call later and hung up the phone. He exhaled a sigh of relief. The day was going well, and he planned to propose to Jung-oh and then bring her to his parents' house for dinner. Putting on his jacket, the man took another look at himself in the mirror. Even though he was sure of what he wanted, he was still very nervous. Grabbing the ring box, he put it in his trouser pocket and headed for the exit. Ji-hyun was excited, imagining what his and Jung-oh's baby would look like once born. How he or she would look like both of them. He dreamed of the first time he would let their child step on freshly fallen snow. How he will teach the child how to ride a bike. How he will hold his little hands. He imagined defending them and telling them how much he loved their child looking into their eyes. Encouraged by these thoughts, the man couldn't wait to meet his girlfriend. He went down to the car park. He walked on looking at his watch and checking the time, hoping he wouldn't be late. Suddenly, he heard tires squealing and turned round to see the headlights illuminating his. Ji-hyun didn't have time to realize or consider anything when the light approached him, and at high speed he was thrown to the ground. He was lying on the ground. His mind was confused, but the only thing he was thinking was that it couldn't have happened to him on a day like this. Suddenly, a man got out of the car and slowly approached Ji-hyun lying on the ground. He heard the stranger ask if he'd heard the name. Which name he couldn't hear. Ji-hyun breathed heavily and looked at the stranger, unable to understand what he was saying to him. The stranger lowered his cap over his eyes and turned round, heading back to the car. Ji-hyun trembled and couldn't understand why the man was leaving. He couldn't speak, but silently begged him not to leave him here to die. The car's engine roared and the car began to move away. The weakened man reached into his pocket with trembling hands for the ring. Consciousness was slipping away from him, and all he could think about was that he had to meet Jung-oh. He wanted to protect her and the baby and wanted them to live happily ever after. The man was afraid that if he were gone, the girl might refuse to keep the child. But he wouldn't blame her. as he understood how difficult it would be to raise a child alone. Before he passed out, the last thing he thought was that he was sorry he hadn't said a word of love to her that time. He shouldn't have put it off until later. Ji-hyun's life was being fought for in the operating theater for hours. The man's mother cried incessantly and prayed that he would survive. Suddenly, police officers came up to her and said they had some information. They said that unfortunately, due to a fault in the video surveillance system, the footage of the accident could not be found. But they recognized the number plate of the car thanks to a video recorder from another vehicle. One of the investigators also said that the video recorder captured the moment of the hit and how the driver left the scene. They have tentatively identified him. The woman grabbed his hands and began tearfully begging him to catch this criminal. A man asked if she knew someone called Jingu Kim. They thought he might be the one they were looking for. Suddenly, a girl's voice came out. A young girl approached them and claimed to have witnessed the accident. She said she had just moved into a flat in the same building and was just going down to the car park at the time of the incident. The girl sat down in front of Ji-hyun's mother and took her hands and told her that her name was Eunbi, and she was the younger sister of Ji-hyun's friend. She said that she transferred to the same university as Ji-hyun after studying abroad and that she had just arrived. The woman looked at her with eyes full of tears. Mrs. Jang finally remembered the girl. She hugged the girl, sobbing and asking what she should do now. Eunbi was a little embarrassed and tried to calm her down, telling her that everything was going to be all right. She wiped the woman's tears with a handkerchief and told her to go home and get some rest. In the meantime, the girl will give a statement to the police, and as soon as the operation is over, she will inform her. Later at the police station, the girl said she saw a tall man in black clothes and a black cap with a hoarse voice. Suddenly, one of the policemen announced that they had brought a suspect in the attack on Ji-hyun. The girl stood up angrily and stared at the strange man. It was the same surly guy that Eunbi saw in car park. He was looking around angrily. The girl immediately recognized him and shouted that he was the guy who hit Ji-hyun. The man, however, shouted that she was lying. He started shouting, asking why she was doing this to him. He said she didn't even know who he was. But the girl confidently pointed at him and said that it was definitely him, and that even his voice was exactly the same as what she had heard. Shortly afterwards, the investigator told Mrs. Jang that thanks to Eunbi's testimony, they were able to quickly arrest the perpetrator and wished her son a speedy recovery. He held out a bag of stuff and said that this was what Ji-hyun had with him when they found him. The woman was very surprised to see a red velvet box among his things, but she kept silent and thanked the investigator and took the things away. Mrs. Jang sat by the bedside next to her son, who was still unconscious after the operation. She thought about what she had seen and wondered if her son had really decided to marry someone without even consulting his parents. She knew it wasn't right, but she couldn't continue to sit still. So she took his phone and, using her son's finger, unlocked it. Upon opening the messages, the woman immediately found the correspondence with his girlfriend and read it. Jango was worried about why he didn't come to the meeting and didn't answer her calls. She was angry at the girl and couldn't let her son date her. So she texted her on his behalf to stop her trying to contact him anymore. Jango was walking around the flat, unable to find her place. She thought it was strange that her boyfriend had changed his mind so suddenly and sent her a text message like that after several days of silence. She finally decided that Ji-hyun couldn't do that to her and was sure that something had happened to him. She put on her coat and walked resolutely towards the exit. Mrs. Jang went to her son's flat and found a photo there with Jango, apparently his girlfriend. She immediately remembered the last conversation she had with her son and that he wanted to introduce her and her husband to someone else. The woman took the photo in her hands and examined it carefully. She recognized that the girl was a freshman at the university where her son studied. Moreover, she was the daughter of a single mother. The woman couldn't come to terms with such a disgrace. She wondered, could it really be that her son wanted to get involved with this girl? Her family didn't even have a middle-class income. She sighed disappointedly and asked if he really wanted to introduce her to a girl like that. Suddenly, the woman heard someone insistently ringing the doorbell. She angrily crumpled the photograph in her hand. She headed towards the door. At that moment, a cry echoed from outside. The girl was calling for Ji-hyun, pleading to be let in. Jango excitedly pounded her fists on the door and called out to her boyfriend. To her surprise, a middle-aged woman opened the door and the girl stopped talking in surprise. Then she apologized and said she wanted to talk to the owner of the flat, Ji-hyun Jung. The woman looked at her with disdain and asked if her name was Jung-oh Lee. She said she was Ji-hyun's mother and asked the girl to go inside and not make a scene in the corridor. Mrs. Jang stepped back, letting the girl pass, and cast a glance at her. The woman thought with disgust at how impudent this girl was. She entered a stranger's house and did not hesitate to take off her shoes. It was obvious that she had grown up without a father. She had no manners whatsoever. Jango looked at the woman in surprise, unable to understand why she was looking at her in such a hostile manner. Before she could say hello and introduce herself properly, the woman interrupted her and asked her if she thought it wasn't rude to knock so brazenly on other people's doors. The girl was embarrassed and said that Ji-hyun had previously given her the password to the door. The man's mother said that the password had recently been changed. She kept giving her a disgruntled look and asked if she should have stopped banging on the door when she realized the password didn't work. Jango apologized and quickly asked if something was wrong with Ji-hyun. She said she was very worried about him and couldn't get in touch with him. The woman frowned and hissed angrily. Hasn't she gotten tired of bothering her son? She said he was so annoyed by her intrusive behavior that he sent his mother instead to get rid of the annoying girl once and for all. She couldn't believe that her sweet boyfriend could do such a cruel thing to her. Couldn't believe it was true. Mrs. Jang turned away from her and said that she hoped the girl understood and would not bother their family again. But Jango grabbed the woman's hand in desperation and began begging her to let them meet and talk one last time. The woman didn't expect such insolence. She jerked her hand out and shouted angrily, "How dare this girl touch her?" In her emotions, she almost blabbed about what had happened to Ji-hyun. Mrs. Jang frowned and thought that there was no way this girl could know that Ji-hyun was in the hospital, so she decided to make her disappear from her sons. She turned round and threateningly told Jango to stay as far away from her son as possible and not to dare try to contact him again. Jango was confused. The world around her seemed to be shrinking, resentment and pain filling her eyes. Could he have treated her so cruelly? After a while, the woman sat by her son's bedside and clutched his hand in her palms. She was crying and begging her son to come to his senses. 2 weeks after the operation, the doctors assured her that everything had gone fine. Eunbi appeared in the doorway and greeted the woman cheerfully. The girl began to urge her to go home and get some rest, for she looked exhausted. She said she asked a doctor she knew to put the woman on a nutrient drip. Mrs. Jang was very touched by her concern. Although she tried to refuse, Eunbi encouraged her and said that maybe Ji-hyun would wake up today, and it would be painful for him to see his mother's unhealthy appearance. So the girl persisted in sending the woman to the drip line. Mrs. Jang couldn't get enough of what a beautiful and well-mannered girl Eunbi was. She has a good education, and her father is Judge Seobak Chai. The woman dreamed of her son dating her. She thanked the girl for her concern and said she would leave the care of Ji-hyun to her in that case. The girl replied that she would be happy to take care of him. Eunbi waved contentedly at the woman and closed the door to the ward. She was glad that she was able to be alone with the man. She walked over to Ji-hyun's bed and began to scrutinize him closely. Even though he was unconscious after the operation, he was very attractive. The girl leaned towards him and thought she really wanted to kiss him. If she did it right now, no one would ever know. But suddenly, the door to the ward opened abruptly, and the girl bounced away from him. It was Ji-hyun's friend, Seung-gyu. The man was surprised to see her and asked what she was doing here. He said he's been seeing too much of her lately. Seung-gyu went to school and university with Ji-hyun, but Eunbi and her older brother hated him. The girl asked why he had come. The man sat down on a chair and said he had come to see a friend, of course. He said he found out something very strange about the Ji-hyun case. His accident happened at 10 minutes past 1, but police said they got the call at 1:30 p.m., and they also said the caller was a man. Eunbi tensed up. The man asked if she hadn't claimed to be the only witness to the incident. He asked why she hadn't called the police right away. Suspicion and disapproval were evident in his voice. It was clear that the girl was hiding something. She tensed up and started biting her lips. Then she finally said that her phone had been dead and that she called the police as soon as she charged it. But Seung-gyu was not calming down and irritably asked why she hadn't run to security, since the situation was urgent. But the girl didn't listen to him. She jumped up from the chair and screamed that Ji-hyun had regained consciousness. The man began to breathe heavily and turn his head, trying to open his eyes. The young people both jumped to his side and started calling his name. In their joy and excitement that their friend had regained consciousness, they immediately forgot about everything they had been talking about. Ji-hyun reached out with his weakened hand, removed the mask, and took a deep breath of air. Seung-gyu held back tears of joy and asked if his friend could see him and if he would recognize him. But the man stared at him as if seeing him for the first time and asked, "Who are you?" Seung-yu was filled with horror. Could it be that his friend had lost his memory? He approached him and began to frantically explain that his name was Seung-yu, and that they had studied together in high school and university, and later he had been his senior in the military. He said that they had always been good friends. The man was in shock, unable to believe that such a thing had happened to his friend. He asked if he really didn't remember anything and begged him to say that he was just joking. Ji-hyun stared at the man in confusion and asked when he had managed to finish his military service. At that moment, Ji-hyun's mother burst into the room, tearful, and immediately rushed to his side. She gently cupped his face in her hands, choking on her tears as she asked if he was all right, and if he had any idea how much she had worried about him. The man's head began to throb intensely, and he groaned. He couldn't bear such a flood of information. Mrs. Jang stood outside her son's room, trying to process the information the doctor had given her. Ji-hyun had lost his memory of the past 3 years. Now, he believed he was 23 years old. The doctor had warned her that his recovery was the most important thing right now, so they should not disturb him. Eunbi approached the woman, wanting to offer her support and find out how things were going with her son. The woman looked at the girl in despair and burst into tears. Later, they sat in the hospital foyer, and the woman, trembling, told the girl that the doctor had said Ji-hyun's memory might not fully recover. Eunbi sighed and said that in that case, he might have forgotten about her as well. The man's mother looked at her in confusion and asked what she meant. The girl blushed and said that the woman must not have known, but Ji-hyun had always been very kind to her and took care of her. She explained that he had proposed they start dating when she returned to Korea after her studies, but it seemed that now he wouldn't even remember that. Mrs. Jang was beside herself with happiness, immediately forgetting about her son's problems. She took the girl's hand and joyfully said that his amnesia wasn't an issue, as they could simply start everything from the beginning. Ji-hyun lay in his room, deep in thought. He felt as if he had forgotten something very important, but he couldn't quite remember what it was. His mother entered the room and asked how he was feeling. The man replied that he felt mediocre. The woman became upset, feeling sad and sorry for her son. But then, she suddenly became more upbeat and asked if he had seen Eunbi yet. She told him that the girl had been coming to his room every day and was very worried about him. The man was surprised and asked if she was talking about Yoon-yup's younger sister. He couldn't understand why she was suddenly here. The woman was happy that her son remembered the girl. She told him that he had thought she was very cute and even wanted to start dating her after her return to Korea. Ji-hyun was surprised and said that it was rather strange since she had never been his type. Mrs. Jang tensed up a little. This was her chance to make her son take an interest in a suitable girl. She smiled and said that Eunbi was very sweet and had been a great help to her while he was unconscious. Suddenly, the man grabbed his head in agony from a sharp pain. The woman immediately became worried and started asking what had happened and where it hurt. She was worried that perhaps her son had been trying hard to remember something, which caused the headache. She was also anxious that he might suddenly remember Jango. Seeing his mother worry, Ji-hyun smiled and said that everything was fine. He folded his hands and confessed to his mother that he felt like he had forgotten something very important, and it was bothering him. Jango arrived at the women's clinic and stood outside, hesitating whether to go in or not. She watched a couple leaving the clinic, seeing how gently the man helped his pregnant wife and how happy they looked. Pain and resentment lodged in her throat, as she thought that she and Ji-hyun could have been just as happy. She still couldn't understand why he had decided to treat her so cruelly. Suddenly, she felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She started feeling unwell and decided it would be better to head home. The girl lay in bed, breathing heavily. The morning sickness had been tormenting her for days, and on top of that, her emotional state was far from good. Suddenly, her phone rang. She glanced at the screen indifferently, but her heart skipped a beat. It was Ji-hyun calling, and a spark of hope ignited in her heart. She answered the call and jumped up in bed, calling out his name. The girl hoped that everything that had happened before was just a cruel joke or misunderstanding, and that now he would tell her that he would never leave her. She heard his voice and she recognized it. Tears welled up in her eyes. The girl quickly asked him why he hadn't called her for so long. She asked what was going on and told him that she had been very worried about him. The man replied that he was fine and that she shouldn't worry. Relieved, the girl placed her hand on her forehead and exhaled deeply. She asked where he was and said that she would come to him right away. To her surprise, Ji-hyun sounded angry and said that she had already spoken to his mother, yet still kept calling and texting. Didn't she realize that it was over between them? The girl listened to her boyfriend's cold voice and felt her heart sink deeply. The man told her not to contact him again if she didn't want to ruin anyone else's life. The girl froze in horror at his threat. He told her that she would regret it if she called him again. Exhaling with a trembling voice, Jango asked him again. Ji-hyun said that he hoped she now understood the meaning of what he had been trying to convey to her. With those words, he hung up. The girl was filled with dread and fear. Jango refused to believe that this was true. It all felt like some kind of prank. She pressed the call button and tried to dial his number again. But it turned out that her number was blocked, and all she heard was the short beeping sound. She realized that from now on, she would have to handle everything on her own. On the first birthday of their daughter, Jango thought about would it be interesting for Ji-hyun to know that today their daughter had turned 1. She already called her mama, and sometimes said the word papa, probably having heard it somewhere. Time passed, and their child had already learned to run. She started attending kindergarten, very curious and with a good appetite. The baby girl loves to touch Jango's face and smile, and she also enjoys singing. The girl was eager to tell Ji-hyun that next year their daughter would be starting elementary school. She was very smart and sweet, with many friends. And even though she didn't have a father, she shone brightly and embraced life with joy. Jango decided that she would no longer wait for his call or for him to appear in their lives. Yena turned 5 years old. The girl asked her mother, "Why is there a prize machine here?" She began jumping in place with excitement, repeatedly asking, "Why is it here?" Jango crossed her arms and, smiling, asked her daughter why she was asking. Was she hoping to win a prize, or was it just out of curiosity? The little girl smiled slyly and honestly replied that she wanted to win a prize. The girl thought about how her daughter was only 5 years old, yet already so crafty. She told her that she could play just once. Jango poured a handful of coins into her little hand. Yena began methodically inserting the coins into the prize machine. Then she turned the knob and a ball with a toy fell out of the machine. The girl smiled brightly and shouted that it was exactly what she wanted. She called for her mom to come and look at her prize. She said that these 2 balls looked like 2 go pieces, one black and the other white. Jango smiled, happy to see how joyful her daughter was. The mother told her to put them in her pocket and not to play with them outside, and the girl obeyed. Jango was happy with her daughter. Ji-hyun had never told her that he loved her, and now she had stopped waiting for his call. After all these years, she was finally ready to forget about him, and was grateful for having Yena. Everything was perfect between her and her daughter. To be continued. Thank you all for watching this video. Please subscribe and like this video. Thanks to you, we can become better.